I am an adjunct faculty here at the business school. I teach a class in the spring with a woman named Amy Rosen called the Education Consulting Lab. And and we talk a lot about education reform issues and bring in guest speakers, including people like John King and Professor Liebman from the law school. And students do consulting projects with local education nonprofits and government agencies. And that runs every spring. Currently, I work at Sesame Workshop, which is a show you may have heard of called Sesame Street, helping them think about how they can have a bigger impact on preschools in this country and early childhood education. Before that, I had the honor and pleasure of working for John at the New York State Education Department. With regards to tonight, I wanted to thank Sandra Navalli and her team at the Social Enterprise Program for setting this up, and Luke Justice for promoting just this event, and Professor Liebman for promoting this as well in his center over at the law school. And just quick show of hands, how many of you are in the business school? How many are law school? Teachers College? SEPA? And what we call them in college, GDIs, goddamn independence. Any GDIs? I know we have a couple of NYU students. Okay, great. So before becoming commissioner of the New York State Education Department, and John, before he was named commissioner, served as the senior deputy for pre-K through 12 education there. He founded some of the highest performing charter schools in this country. Schools that, if you've never been to a high performing school that serves low income children well, you need to go see them, because these are schools that literally change the lives of kids and of their families that have often been living in a cycle of poverty for generations. Does anybody know the name of the charter school that John founded in Boston? And if you raise your hand. Yes?
I don't know, sorry. Let's say Roxbury Press.
Okay. It is?
She was right, Roxbury Press.
Oh! And out of my magic bag. I told you I worked for Sesame. After Roxbury, John went on to run a number of charter schools here in New York City that are a part of one of the most successful, I'd say, charter management organizations. Anybody know anything about that? Do you like cookie or bird? And John, John now works very closely with a woman who he went to Teachers College here with, who now is the Chancellor of Education for the state of New York. Maybe you know who that is. She's from a big philanthropic family here in New York.
New York Giants, right after.
Yep, Merrill Fish. And it works. So John has, I'd say, in his role as commissioner and working for him, taken these lessons learned and how do you create these amazing schools and get all the adults in the schools working in service of the kids to achieve at high levels, and is working now to take those to scale across the state. And I love this quote from him. That was in the New York Times. "My life story is about the power of schools to shape lives, even against great odds. I know that all of our schools can be places that ensure our children succeed." In terms of his own academic pursuits, John has been a bit of an underachiever. He got his BA in government from Harvard, and then he got his master's in teaching social studies here from TC. He got a JD from Yale Law, and then finally a doctorate in education administration from Teachers College. Short list. So I would say to those of you who are here, who are thinking about a career in education, I would really encourage you to think thoughtfully about doing that now, because there are people like John who are leading initiatives in the state who are so desperate may not be the right word, but who really but who need the talent and skills that you bring to the table. I mean, and forget about John. Think about the kids, like, who literally are sitting in education systems that don't function the way they should yet for these kids. And I mean that. I went to business school at Kellogg. I never would have thought I would spend 10 years working inside government organizations. It is an incredibly rewarding and satisfying career. And there's just really a sense of urgency, and you can all have such an impact. So John will talk a lot about the work that he's doing at the state and the roles that he needs, and I'm happy to talk to anyone afterwards about my experience and help connect you with the folks at State Ed. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. John Gibbs.
Now, Sesame Street characters has to be the most unusual introduction that I have ever had. My 5-year-old and 7-year-old will like that. So what I thought I'd do is I'd spend probably about 10, 15 minutes kind of framing what we're working on at the state level, what the charge is that I carry with me to work every day, and then talk a little bit about some of the challenges we face, and then talk about how people in this room and people in rooms like it might be able to help us with this work. Oh, thank you. So let me start with what we see as our most urgent mission. In New York State last year, we graduated about 73% of our students. So think for a moment about what the life prospects are of a student who doesn't graduate from high school. Right? So nearly 30% of our kids, no high school diploma. What jobs are possible? What opportunity to buy a house, send your kids to school, send your kids to college, right? What opportunities are available if you don't have a high school diploma today in the United States? But then if you look at that 73% of kids who did graduate, our analysis suggests that only about half those, about 37% of our students, are graduating with the skills they need to succeed in a freshman year credit-bearing math or English course. And I'm not talking about the skills they need to graduate from a 4-year institution. I'm talking about the skills they need to enroll in a credit-bearing first-year community college course. And we know that when we look at our colleges, in our 2-year colleges around the state, 40% of the entering students, when they arrive, enroll in high school classes, remedial courses. In New York City, in the CUNY 2-year institutions, that number is 75%. Right, so imagine you show up at college, you think you're ready to do college work. You may even have a Regents diploma in hand, and then they tell you have to take high school classes, and guess what? You're paying for those classes, not the state, right? So now you are absorbing the cost of these courses that get you no closer to college graduation. So most fundamentally, what we take our charge to be at the department is to ensure that more of our students are college and career ready. That every student ought to graduate from high school in 12th grade with the full range of choices in front of them, the ability to choose a career and be successful in that career, or choose college and be successful in college. And that's not happening today. The other challenge we have as a state education department is to just do our work better. Historically, state education departments are perceived as places that are largely regulatory rather than customer service oriented. So on my first day as commissioner back in June, I brought together all of our staff at the department, and I said 2 tasks in front of us: college and career readiness and customer service. I want people to walk away from their interactions with the department saying the department was helpful to them. I was with a commissioner from another state who was joking about the experience of walking into rooms and saying, "I'm here from the state, I'm here to help," and people seeing that as a laugh line. That's not good. That's not what we're aiming for. And we have the potential to do that, right? Every person who I've met around the state who's had interaction with the State Department, all the superintendents, let's say, will often say, they'll often name one person. They'll say, "I hate dealing with the department, but there's this one person who I have great interactions with." And what I've asked my colleagues to think about is, so how do we make that our brand? How do we get to a place where the brand of the State Education Department in New York is helpful to teachers and to parents and to students and to principals and administrators? So those are our 2 charges. We've got a strategy that has essentially 4 elements, and I'll describe them each in sequence. One strategy is around these new Common Core standards that you've probably heard about. 48 states and 3 territories work together to create common standards for English and math. And for the first time, they created those standards by mapping backwards from college and career readiness. So they asked college faculty, what are the skills students need to succeed in first-year courses? And they asked employers, what are the skills that young people need in entry-level jobs to be successful and be on a career path that is successful? And then using that, they map backwards from there to what that meant about what students need to know in 10th grade or 7th grade or 3rd grade. And it's very different. Historically, the way we've created standards is we say, oh, what does a kindergartner know? Well, a 1st grader probably needs to know a little bit more than a kindergartner, and a 2nd grader a little bit more than that. These standards are very different, and they start with college and career success. And so our work, first we adopted the standards as a state, and now we are figuring out ways to help give tools to teachers and principals in schools to implement those standards. So some of our work is developing online professional development tools, videos that explain what the Common Core is, how it works, what the implications are for instruction, developing sample materials that teachers can use in the classroom, and then aligning our state tests, which is one of our biggest drivers of behavior, with those new Common Core standards. So too often our state tests don't reflect the skills we know students need to be successful later on. So for example, when I first got to the department, we had some years in which we tested English language arts without testing writing skills. Right? And so we changed that, so now we test writing skills in all grades 3 through 8, and then again in 11th grade in high school. So just as simple as that, trying to change our tests so that we are pointing teachers and principals and students towards what matters most, the skills that matter most. Some other examples around the Common Core. One of the things that the authors found when they talked to employers and to higher ed institutions is that students are mostly asked to read nonfiction. Probably most of what you're reading, whether it's at TC or business school or law school, is mostly nonfiction text. And that's probably what your experience was in college. And yet in our K through 12 education system, we almost exclusively teach through novels. Right? And then when students are first confronted with nonfiction, they're overwhelmed by it. And they say, oh, there's so much reading, and it's so hard to get through, and it's not that engaging compared to the novels I was just reading in high school. And so one of the things we're doing is shifting instruction in the state towards nonfiction text. Another example, we know that in the United States, we teach many more math topics in any given year than most of our international competitors. Yet they do better on the same test than our students do. And part of that is that we have a culture in the United States around math instruction where, if the student doesn't understand something, you say to yourself, I won't worry about it too much because a week from now we're moving on to the next thing. Right? And so we never get to that deep level of mastery that ensures students are prepared for the next level. We also oftentimes have chosen the wrong things to focus on. So one of the authors of the Common Core often says, we lead the world in patterns. We're the best at patterns. And you give pattern problems to kids internationally and to American students far surpass students from other countries. Unfortunately, patterns are not a very good predictor of performance in advanced math. But fractions are a good predictor, and we don't do nearly as well in fractions. And so we've got to make better choices, and the Common Core reflects that. So a lot of our work is on that first strategy, Common Core, standards, curriculum, and assessment aligned with college and career readiness. Second major strategy is around data. It's not necessarily the sexiest topic, although Professor Liebman may find it so. But data are, I always do that, data are incredibly important to our work. And we see the data work in two categories. One is we need to be able to track student performance from the early grades through the K through 12 system into college and into careers. You may have read about how last year, or actually the year before last, we changed the cut scores on our state tests and dramatically lowered performance on the state tests around the state. It made a lot of people very mad. But I believe it was the right thing, and part of why I believe it was the right thing is we used data from students' performance in college to look back at how they did in high school, and we asked, based on how they did in high school, what score did they need on the high school test to predict success in college? And then we look back to 3rd through 8th grade, and we asked, what scores did students need in 8th grade to predict that level of performance on the high school test to predict success in a first-year college course? And what we found is that the students we were calling proficient in 8th grade had a 1/3 or less chance of being able to pass a first-year community college course. And so that is no one's definition of proficient. And so we moved our proficiency bar. It lowered our cut scores, but it was the right thing so that people, again, were pointed in the right direction. So part of the work on data is just the linkages between our different data sets that we collect, right, across the P through 20 system, we call it. The second piece around data is making sure that teachers can access the data and principals and use it in real time. And this is what Professor Liebman worked on when he was with New York City DOE. It's not that helpful just to know what the score was after the game is over, right? Sometimes I call it the post-mortem analysis of data. Last year, that's how my students did. It may be helpful, but it's not that helpful. More useful is it's October, and I figure out who actually mastered the skill that we've been trying to work on for the last 2 months, and what do I do with that information to now teach differently or more or less, depending on the subject area, over the next 2 months so that I can help my students do better. Those kinds of tools are very powerful for principals and teachers, and so we are building those kinds of tools at the department. So a lot of our work around data, again, it isn't necessarily the most sexy part of the work, but it is foundational to moving our agenda forward. Third key strategy is around teacher and leader effectiveness. 80% of the budget of school districts is spent on people, usually, sometimes higher, 85%. So if you want to change the productivity function, I think this is right, the business school people in the room could correct me on this. If you want to change the productivity function for education, you have to do something about the people, right? The way to make schools more effective is to make teachers and principals more effective. And then the question is, how do you do that? Our answer is you build a performance management system that allows you to understand who's doing well, who's doing poorly, make the people who are doing well models for everyone else, and have interventions for the people who are doing poorly. Most school districts around the state, prior to this year, have a binary evaluation system. That is, they evaluate teachers and principals as satisfactory or unsatisfactory. And in most districts, that means everybody's satisfactory and hardly anybody's unsatisfactory. Right. When we tried to do a survey of some of our biggest districts in the state to ask them about their performance management, we said, well, how many people were in each category, in each school? And they said, and some of our districts said, we're not sure. We don't collect that information centrally. It's very hard to build a performance management system if you don't know how anybody is doing, right? But even with that satisfactory, unsatisfactory, if 99.9% of people are in the satisfactory category, again, not much you can do with that information to help people improve their performance. So as part of our Race to the Top work, we passed a state law that for the first time required differentiated evaluations, evaluation of educators as highly effective, effective, developing, or ineffective, so that we can do performance management. An evaluation system that includes evidence about student performance, so whether or not students are making progress in a teacher's classroom or a principal's school. And an evaluation system that has real consequences. If you're in that ineffective category for 2 years in a row, then you have an expedited removal process, because it means despite having an improvement plan, you haven't gotten better. And the politics around the eval system are complicated, but the bottom line reason for this evaluation system is to have better performance management. And so that is a huge area of our work. It is one of the most challenging to figure out, right? Because you got to figure out, well, how do you evaluate the performance of the art teacher, of the social studies teacher? What do you do if you don't have a state test in a given subject? How do you measure whether or not students are making progress? And once you have all that information, what do you then do with it to help people get better? Right? So a good performance management system shouldn't just help you sort. It should help you get the people who are struggling to be better and get the people who are in the middle to be better, right? And so a lot of our work now is figuring out this year, as this is the first year of this new system, how do we then use the information to help people get better? We at the same time are looking at teacher and principal preparation and asking, what lessons about teacher and principal effectiveness can we link back to teacher and principal preparation? And this links to data as well. What data about teacher effectiveness can we link back to teacher and principal preparation? So that is a core function of the department. One of the things that's unique about the New York State Education Department is we not only oversee K through 12 education, we also oversee higher education in the state. And so we're responsible for the certification of over 250,000 educators in New York State. And so that's a very powerful lever for us in changing practice in schools. the fourth strategy, the final strategy, is around turning around our lowest performing schools. We have some schools in this state that have been failing not for 1 year, not for 5 years, not for 10 years, but literally for generations. Schools that have graduation rates in the 30s. Imagine sitting in your freshman year classroom and knowing that 70% of your classmates aren't going to make it. We have schools that build their schedule on that assumption. They have a schedule for freshmen because that's where they have a lot of kids, and then they have a schedule for everyone else because there are so many fewer of them. Right? Many times these schools are unsafe, and they are schools where it's very hard for a student to find their way to college and career readiness. And so turning around performance in those schools is a critical part of our strategy. We are trying to use innovation to do that, asking schools to rethink how school works, how the school day is organized, the role that teachers play, the kinds of work that's put in front of students. We are innovating around structure. So we passed, as part of the Race to the Top, we passed a law that allows partner organizations, community-based organizations, to literally take over and manage schools via a contract with the district for the first time in New York. So we're trying a variety of strategies because what we know is what we've been doing in these schools hasn't been working. So those are the four core elements of our strategy. It is incredibly difficult to execute on this strategy. That's why we're desperate. It really is incredibly difficult. There was a paper that AEI just put out on state education departments. And one of the themes of this paper was that much of the federal agenda, and you'll see this even more over the next few days as the U.S. Department of Education is likely to issue their waiver guidance around No Child Left Behind. Much of the education reform agenda, certainly of the U.S. Department of Education and the current administration, depends on state education departments to do work they've never been asked to do before on a timeline they've never been asked to meet before. And so that brings with it incredible challenges. We've been cut, our state funding to the department has been cut 40% in the last 2.5 years. We have gone from 3,200 employees to just under 2,700 in the last 3 years. So our capacity is incredibly stretched just to do the old work, and we've taken on all this new work. Now, we are fortunate to get Race to the Top money, so we've got $700 million to put towards this reform agenda. But in the context of statewide spending on public education that's about $55 billion per year, $700 million is a very small, over a 4-year period, is a very small lever for change. And so we've got to make exactly the right bets in exactly the most efficient way and use those bets to leverage big change across 700 districts, each of which has its own school board and superintendent. And so the context for the work is very challenging. We also confront a very difficult fiscal environment for our districts. So sometimes I'm with superintendents and they say, love everything that you want us to do, but I just had to lay off 20 teachers and expect to lay off dozens more this year. How can I do all of this? And so at the same time as we're pressing this reform agenda, we also have to help people figure out how to do, quite literally, more with less. So we're thinking about how do you leverage technology to do that? How do you fundamentally rethink the way schools are organized to do that? And the problem 5 years from now will be much worse than today. When I'm talking to superintendents or school boards, I often say, as bad as you think it is going to get much, much worse. We confront a huge legacy cost problem across our districts and in state government, frankly, as well. Right? So districts that are losing population have very large obligations to retirees, both in terms of pensions and healthcare benefits. And it's going to get harder and harder to meet those legacy obligations while at the same time paying for actual academic programming for current students. And so that picture only gets worse in the out years. We also have, obviously, a very difficult fiscal climate for the state, and the state's support for schools has been declining over the last 2 years. And it will be a challenge to see if the state can find the resources to meet the obligations that we've committed to as a state. So that adds to the complexity of the moment. A final piece to the context, and then I'd just love to, and then I'll talk a little bit about the exact positions we need and then throw it open for questions. Technology has tremendous potential to transform our current education sector. And higher ed is already seeing this. I was with a president of a very elite private university who was pointing out that bricks and mortar universities now have to change their value proposition with students, right? Except for the very elite, right, who have a value proposition that's in part linked to their name and the value of saying their name when you introduce yourself. Many bricks and mortar institutions now are competing with online institutions that can provide the same academic content without all the costs of a campus and all the costs that come with managing a bricks and mortar facility, and they can provide it anytime you want. And that is shifting how higher ed happens, and we expect that will have significant implications for how we organize schools. And that is very anxiety-producing for people. The notion that school may not be 10 years from now, 25 kids in a classroom in front of one teacher for 6.5 hours a day makes people very anxious. Right? And thinking about, well, what does that mean? Would students be in groups? Would students sit in front of computers all day? Are we going to have students take assessments on computers? Does that mean students need to type? And the Common Core standards would say students need to start keyboarding in 3rd grade. Some schools don't give that kind of access to computers to students in 3rd grade. So there's this sea change that's happening around technology that only adds to people's anxiety and the complexity of our environment. So what are the things we need? 2 categories. One, we need technical expertise in particular areas. Assessment design. We need technical expertise to figure out what do good assessments aligned with the Common Core look like. We need technical expertise around the teacher and leader effectiveness work. Right? What are different ways that we could think about using certification or evaluation systems as a lever for change in schools? And we need project management skills. Right? How do you decide when you're trying to transform how principals are trained all over the state? What do you do first? What do you do second? How quickly do you do it? What resources do you leverage? What tools can you use? What metrics will you use to measure if what you're doing is having an impact on the field? And so we need people who are good at the school side of things. We need people who are good at the project management side of things. We need people with expertise around virtual learning and the role of technology in education. We need people who have expertise around school turnaround work, which is very rare to find since no one has done school turnaround successfully at scale. So people who have a real vision of how you go into a school that has been underperforming for generations and get all the adults in that school to buy into a different way of thinking about how to do school and then effectively execute on that strategy. We're so desperate for talent, in fact, that we decided that we couldn't get enough talent on our public dollars. And so we've actually raised a significant amount of private philanthropy to support the development of what we call our Regents Research Fund, a think tank that's based here in the city. Essentially a think tank to help inform our work on the rest of the agenda. We just need as many smart, talented people as we can get to move this ambitious agenda forward. A final word about what's possible. So last week I was with Chancellor Walcott at Aviation High in Queens. If you get a chance to visit a school, right? You've been there. It's an amazing experience. They literally have a hangar in the school where they have aircraft that students are working on. I walked into the hangar and I walked up to a young man and I said, "Tell me what you're doing." He walks me over to this computer where he gets these bulletins from the FAA about what to check on the aircraft. And it was a good illustration. Actually, one of my staff people said, it's exactly what we're always talking about technical language and how difficult the technical reading is in careers that actually pay you enough to have a good salary and health insurance. You often have to do technical reading that is at least as difficult as the kind of reading you need to do in a first-year community college course. So he hands me this report that has all this technical language on it, and he tries to explain it to me, and I'm already sort of overwhelmed because I have I don't even hang pictures in my house. So this is all very overwhelming. And I said to him, well, so then what do you do with this? Show me. And so we walk over to the plane, and he starts showing me the things that he does to check that the plane isn't going to crash, which is an important thing to do. And he had a plan. I mean, what was powerful is he had a very clear plan for his life. He's in his 5th year. Students can stay in their 5th year and they get their license to do aircraft repair. He was clear that he was going to college. He was clear about how much he could earn from the jobs he was being prepared for. I mean, the level of clarity. And so this is a school that has, I think it's about 86% boys. Lots of African-American Latino males in a state where our African-American Latino male performance is abysmal. And these young men have just such a clear vision of what their lives were going to be like. They have the junior ROTC. Talking to the young man who's the unit leader, and he couldn't have his chest pressed out anymore. And he was just describing, again, with such clarity, what his future was going to be after Aviation High. And so I think, my main takeaway leaving that school is, why don't we have 10 more of these, 15 more of these, 100 more of these around the state? Places where students have such a clear vision about their academic future and how that future then should inform their work in school that day. So we need more of that. To get to more of that, we have to do our work better at the department. So that's why I'm here, to try and pitch you on that. So with that, questions, comments, thoughts?
So just a quick question about the school you're referring to.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a privately funded school?
No, it's a district school. It's a New York City public school. It's actually been around for a long time. The principal is an Aviation High alum. It's near the airport, and so it's this long tradition. There's also one around subways, right? There's one where you learn how to be a subway technician, and they actually have a subway car. I haven't been to that one. Yeah, and it's not to say that CTE always works. We have career and technical education schools around the state that are terrible, that are teaching students skills for jobs that used to exist, not jobs that do exist or will exist. And so it shows why the work is so fine-grained, right? And how it takes a lot to go from the policy prescription, right? We should do more career and tech ed. So what does it take to build a career and technical education school that is really excellent? Those are very different things. And aviation would say they have lots of things to improve on, and their academic performance isn't always stellar. But for this young man, what was clear is that this program had provided for him a clear path in life. And we need to do more of that. Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to get your opinion on something. So you talked a lot about kind of performance management and the need to sort of create kind of culture change in order to actually be able to implement that. So several of us in the room actually worked on like the very early stages of rolling out the new teacher evaluation system in New York City over the summer, and found just that it takes a lot of culture change. And so I'm curious, in a city the size of New York, what do you think it's actually going to take in order to be able to, at a very grassroots level, create the culture change that's necessary in schools?
It's a great question. I think part of it is to just start. We had 500 professional development people from across the state for a week in Albany this summer. And they were with us from 8:30 in the morning till 9 at night every day for 5 days. We called it, after the fact, we called it Educator Boot Camp. And one of the themes of that 5 days, and we were training people in the Common Core and evidence-based observation, the observation part of the eval system. And one of the themes we kept coming back to is just start. That you need to begin the process in order, and there's so much anxiety, especially around evaluation, about, well, what's going to happen and what will it be like? And then what you find in schools that are using a common rubric is the emergence of a common language around what good teaching would look like and how you might improve teaching. I was actually with someone from a foundation this afternoon who had visited a school this morning that's one of the New York City pilot schools doing the evaluation system, and talked about just the power of the common language of the Danielson rubric and people being able to talk with each other about instruction in a way that wouldn't be possible if you didn't have that common rubric. So I think part of how we'll get to the change we want is for people to see that it really isn't about punishing teachers or a gotcha system, that it really is about professional growth. Part of the culture change, I think, will come when we shift the conversation to a conversation about growth. So when every teacher in the state opens an envelope with their growth score and has to think about, what does that mean about how students grew or didn't grow? I think that will be powerful. And New York City's a little bit ahead on that And yes, people will be mad, and some people will say this has to be wrong, and the formula can't be right, and there'll be all of that. But just getting people to think about the differential impact of different classrooms. Getting principals to think about the fact that we often see more within school variation in teacher growth scores than across school variation. Right? We all know that to be true. We all instinctively know that in any school, no matter how good or bad, there are some teachers who are excelling and some who are struggling. But when you start to focus people on that conversation, I think it'll be culture changing. Principals need to think differently about their job. And actually one of the hardest parts of shifting the culture on this will be shifting what principals think their job is every day. I think most principals in most buildings know that instructional leadership is important, but find it very hard to block out the time. Certainly when I was a principal, I struggled with, I really should go to that class, but there's this yelling parent on the phone. Or there's this thing that's broken in the copy room. And you're sort of constantly choosing how you allocate your time. And so I think principals understanding their critical role in the system will be very important. And we have a ways to go. I think that means changing how principals are trained. And you can go through a principal preparation program in the city and never talk, really, about what it is to observe a teacher and give them useful feedback about that observation. And so there's a lot of work to do there. Yes, ma'am.
I just moved to New York to attend school, and so I'm trying to get a good sense of the political culture here. I know it's different. I'm coming from Boston. I know it's different than it is in Boston, but I know that Bloomberg is on his way out, and he's also provided a lot of political cover for every form. So where do you see the political context moving in the next year, in the next 2 years, as we all progress out of school? And then what's the plan, what's the contingency plan in case, the cover goes away and all of a sudden there's some very anti-reform in office?
It's a very good question. A couple things. One is there are some things that I think we're doing that aren't inevitable and have the force of history behind them, right? In the sense that, take the role of technology in schools. So I don't think anyone can stop the expanded role of technology in schools because, it's sort of like, I was in a meeting the other day and people were saying, we're resisting that technology would change how the school day happens, and it felt like being in a room with record company executives. When music was first available online and saying like, we're going to stamp it out. There will be no music online. And now that seems preposterous, right? And so I do think there are some things that have an inevitability to them. I think the governor is very committed to accountability in education and has asked really from the time that he took office, we spend $56 billion, $56 billion as a state. Are we getting the best possible return on those dollars? And if not, what should we be doing differently? And he actually, in his first year, put into the budget 2 sort of mini race to the top grants. One focused on performance to reward districts that are making big performance progress, and one focused on efficiency to reward efforts to try and increase the efficiency of education spending. And so I think there's cover that will come for a performance orientation from the governor's commitment to that work. I think there's an urgency that you see from parents that I think is quite powerful. And so I think all of the mayoral candidates will get asked, and I hope they'll get asked, right? What are they going to do to ensure great opportunities for kids in every neighborhood of the city? And I don't think the answer will always be I'm going to do more of what the mayor has done. I mean, the answer may be I'm going to tweak some things that have been done. I'm going to do some things the same. The answer may be complex, but I don't think you'll have a mayoral campaign in which that question isn't asked, because there is such a strong, I think, push from families, and partly school choice has helped to promote that, right? Such a strong push from families across the city, across socioeconomic and demographic factors, to say, well, what's going to be, what kind of school is my kid going to have access to? I do worry that in an environment of declining resources, there's the risk that people fight over whatever's left on the table rather than trying to figure out how to make better use of what's on the table. And that is, I think, a real risk, and you see that across the country. A polarization, an oversimplification of education issues, as though there were two sides. This one writer this one New York Times writer wrote a column criticizing, largely critical of the reform orientation of the department, and said, tried to divide our board into people who are for charter schools and TAS, and people who care about teachers and believe in public schools, I think. Or maybe it was believe in teachers and care about, that's what it was, believe in teachers and care about public schools. Right? I think that is incredibly unhelpful, right, to try and create camps. It is helpful to the people who, sort of in a self-promoting way, make themselves the spokesperson for each of the camps. But it's not a helpful way to move the conversation forward. So, you know, I guess what I'd say is we are on very fragile ground, right? Where we could devolve into camp fighting, and then people looking at this next mayoral campaign as a chance for one camp or the other to prevail. Or we could, I think, come to what I would argue is a better place, which is a vision that starts with students and what's in the best interests of students and grows from there. I think Dennis Walcott has done a really good job in his first few months, shifting the tone, trying to kind of lower the heat of the debate and focus on the light of the debate. I think he is also very mindful of the need to engage parents and communities in a more systematic way in the work of education reform. So I'm hopeful, but I'm sort of always hopeful. So, yeah.
Yeah. You're here to talk about why about coming to work.
Yes.
And I get asked questions, not by law students, but by other students as well. And it's since you went to Yale Law School and you had all sorts of options that were available to you, I think the real question that they're sitting there thinking is, when should I do this? You know, why should I go do this now? Why shouldn't I go work for a law firm or go work in the private sector, out in a business career? You know, get something, whatever that is, and then, you know, then I'll be in a position to think about it, which of course doesn't really happen in a lot of cases because you get a mortgage and everything else based on the salary. So I think they're very good answers to that, but I'd love to hear you.
So first, so two reasons I talk about. One is that I think this is the most important moment in education, maybe ever, but certainly in the last decade, because it is such a fragile political moment. The president made this huge bet on us, right? $700 million. Race to the Top is the president's signature initiative. Congress made a huge bet on us. And so you've got this set of 12 states that have an opportunity to really move an agenda forward in a very short window of time. Dennis Walcott talks about how he has just 2.5 years. We have 3 years left on Race to the Top, right? So in the next 2.5, 3 years, we have a lot that we need to get done to execute on this set of commitments that we made. So one reason that you should do this and not do something else more lucrative is because it is so urgent and critical. And I think the future of our country depends on it. I was with the CEO last week who was talking about coming back from Singapore, where I think they have a minister for manpower or something, a minister for development or human capital, who said, what we understand as a country is this is the investment in our people and the development of our people is the most important thing we can do to win in the future. Right? We know that everything else we do as a country comes second to education and developing our people, because that's what's going to allow us to be successful economically. And I think if we don't get this right, if we don't get this work on Race to the Top right, if we don't get the work on this reform agenda right, we risk watching our country slide into a spiral of decline. Because we won't be able to keep up. We won't be able to keep up. So to me, there's nothing more important for our country's future and our state's future than this work right now. But the second reason, and some is almost a more selfish reason, is it's incredibly gratifying to make schools better. To see, I'm sure you miss that impact, right? To see that your work on some policy issue actually affects what happens for students in their schools. It's quite powerful. I was at an event with our early college high schools. We've got this program that we've done, the state has done together with the Gates Foundation, to have high schools matched up with colleges so that the students can start to take college courses. And we fought for money for this program, and we fought to launch this program, and we managed selection of the schools. And so I was at this event with these high school students who are in, some of them new high schools, some of them high schools that are doing turnarounds, but who now have a much different sense of their direction in life and expect to go to college and are going to start taking college courses in high school. Heard from graduates of some of the early college high schools in the state, and you could see the look on their face of, oh, I could be that person. And so to know that some project that we had done had that impact in a kid's life, very powerful and very satisfying.
You touched on something personal for me. I just moved to New York about a month ago to get married, not because I'm going to school, but I gave up a 10-year teaching job in Los Angeles at a very, very prestigious humanities magnet high school, which I hold near and dear to my heart. And so I am invested in humanities education. And I came to New York and I found, and I was very excited about it, that there's a lot happening in education, which is really wonderful, except that I cannot get a job to save my life as a teacher here. And I am a fairly experienced, I've been teaching for 6 years, middle school and high school. I have a master's in education, and I feel pigeonholed. I want to do something bigger. I'll teach anywhere, but I also want to do something bigger. So I started with applying for teaching jobs, and so when you said, why would we want to do this now? I want to do this now, but I don't seem to be able to find anyone who wants someone who's only a little bit experienced, but is willing and ambitious to be a part of this. So it's not necessarily a question, but I needed to get that off. Thank you. It's an interesting predicament to be in.
Yes. So I would reassure you to say, one is you should look at our postings, because and we should talk afterwards, because there are a couple jobs I think that's your experience is the kind of experience level that we're looking for those jobs. But I would say that as you think about your search, one thing that is unique about New York is that you have lots of organizations that are not the school district and not schools, but are doing really interesting and important work, whether it's charter management organizations or these new education partner organizations that are managing schools like New Visions, exactly, Abyssinian Development. There are a number of them. There are, obviously a number of organizations that then are doing human capital work, like New Teacher Project and Teach for America. So there's more opportunities than there might otherwise be. And all of that said, I think the number is something around 10,000, the number of teachers who were laid off last year around the state. And so, there's this, there is all this innovation, and there's an incredibly difficult fiscal climate.
So it feels very conflicting, because it feels like there are so many opportunities, and yet we are in a dire financial state. And so I feel wanted and unwanted at the same time, which is really a strange place to be in.
Yeah, I think that's right. And one of my challenges in sort of evangelizing on behalf of the work that we're doing is that people say, given the fiscal climate, shouldn't we wait on some of these things? Because it is so hard, and people are saying we had to lay off teachers and so forth. But we are in an odd place as a country, and that if we don't do these things, it won't get better. And so we have, it almost makes the fiscal climate almost makes our work more urgent. But I reassure you, I think that my prediction is that you will find something. And I know there are people in this room even who have recruitment as one of the things that they do. So, so it's good that you. Yes, sir.
Thanks for coming, Dr. King. My situation is very similar to this young lady's here, but from a different perspective, from the corporate world. What is your view on people coming from the corporate world? And I'll talk to Laura very briefly about this. Coming from the corporate world, using the experiences, particularly in financial services, with experiences with strategy, things of that nature, going into the work in academia with little to no experience in that field. What is your view on that? It seems like it's almost an impossible endeavor to try to find something.
Yeah, I think it's I think it's about finding the right spot in an organization. So I'll give 2 examples from today. So one of the jobs that we have posted is I want to say it's contract vendor management or something. It gets very few resumes are submitted for this. It probably goes in the unsexy category with data work, but an immense amount of our work at the department is done through contracts. You know, we do RFPs, we award contracts, and one of the things that government does very poorly, and I think Jim agreed, this is contract management is a notoriously bad government function. You know, think about the RFP process. I was with somebody the other day who's at an event, and he turned to somebody and he said, "Are you really going to eat that cookie?" And the guy said, "Why? What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, it's a low bidder cookie." And it's true, right, in a funny way about RFPs, that the winner is always the best value, which is the lowest bid and highest quality. But there was a funny truth to that about the low bidder cookie. And so one of the tasks, so what happens when you do an RFP? The vendor wins, and then the incentives shift. Right? At the RFP stage, the vendor's incentive is to tell you all the great things they're going to do for very little value. But now once they've been awarded the contract, frankly, the incentive is for them to do exactly what was in the contract and not more, because they're only going to get the amount of money that was awarded. And so aggressive vendor management is a really important task of government. The government generally does poorly, and it's very hard to attract people from the private sector to that kind of job because it seems, it's not a policy job, but it is really important work. Similarly, we built this website, engageny.org, to get out information around the Common Core. And I wish we had more people at the department who understood web design and what makes for a really good website. And we used a vendor to build the website. It's really good, I think. But now we've got to manage it. We've got to manage the content. We've got to have good systems for content management for this website. We're thinking about what things should we have discussion threads, and is that more trouble than it's worth? And there are a ton of questions that are very common private sector questions too. We don't necessarily have people ready to answer. So, I think there actually are a lot of good opportunities. You just have to be very strategic about finding what are the ones that are the right kind of skill set match.
Quick suggestion, we need a title change. The first one, private sector language is strategic sourcing. And coming from the consulting world, if you said strategic sourcing manager.
This is what Laura always tells me. She reads our stuff and she's like, this job description is terrible. Strategic sourcing.
That's what we used to call consulting. And the second one, it'd be like social media marketing. Everyone wants to work in this field. Not website management, but boring. So, helping private sector people translate what they understand from that world to this world.
That's very good advice. That's very good advice. Strategic sourcing. I really like that. That's good. This is what you always tell me. Yes, sir.
You said that technology is about to transform education.
Mm-hmm.
I believe one of the sources of transformation is going to be entrepreneurs.
Mm-hmm.
Entrepreneurs would like to contribute, but I think many of them are scared about dealing with the government because you get trapped in the bureaucracy, you don't get out. So what is your advice for entrepreneurs that really have transformative ideas and they want to do something? So where should they go so they don't get stuck in the bureaucracy? And also, if you're an entrepreneur, you also fear that you're going to get an RFP. I come with a great product and I say, great, now we're going to put an RFP and somebody else is going to do it for cheaper. And it's like, okay, what do I do? So how do we solve these two problems?
Those are both hard problems. A couple thoughts about that. One is that I think the distance between government and the entrepreneurial sector, at least in education, is smaller now than it was 10 or 15 years ago. You get more hybrid organizations like program management organizations or these education partnership organizations that are launching in New York State, I think there's more opportunity to be entrepreneurial in government. I think, if you think about, and Jim, I'd be interested in your take on this, but one of the strategies of the New York City DOE at times was to create new units whose job was to innovate within the New York City DOE, and we've tried to do something similar with this Regents Research Fund, create these sort of pockets of innovation that then can drive changes in practice in the rest of the organization. In terms of the entrepreneur's relationship with government, that is a real problem. I don't know that that's very solvable. I mean, it makes perfect sense why the RFP process is there, right? Because you want to make sure that people are, that you don't have, what does Michelle Bachmann call it? Crony capitalism, right? That you don't want to have people steering business to their friends and all of those things. So that's why you have the RFP process. But then it does create these long delays, and it builds in certain other risks. That is a real challenge. I think part of what we're trying to do, and this is one of the, I don't know if this is strategic sourcing or not, but one of the things that we're trying to do is write RFPs differently to try to spur innovation, right? Because how you write the RFP actually can attract a more entrepreneurial vendor, or it could lock out a more entrepreneurial vendor. And so that one of the tasks of government, I think, is to figure out how do you kind of unlock the potential of the entrepreneurial sector and still honor the state law around, state finance law and RFPs and so forth. No, Jim, how would you answer that?
I think you're right to think about whether you can provide some kind of source from inside, because a lot of school districts and states around the country now are really starting to think about innovating. And in many ways, you have tons of resources, and so that's a thing to be thinking about. Another one, I think, is just there are places where things are exploding. All of a sudden, there's all sorts of things happening. New York City was this way, 8 years ago, something like that. But now they're all over the country. And I think the idea is to kind of get in a place to be able to help them do something that's really important that they need to do at a point where they're really, really willing to take extraordinary steps to get, not get around the laws, but to, work within the laws, but to do things that usually they say, oh, it's too much trouble, let's not do it. And then once you've established yourself that way and you've got a product that has been used, it can kind of feed on itself, and then other people want to do it, and it becomes easier for you. So to kind of think strategically. I mean, there's about to be an explosion maybe in Detroit, where there's a lot of interesting things happening, or in New Orleans or Bridgeport maybe. So, kind of thinking about how you can provide some sort of, some resources for them and take a risk in a sense. You have to take the risk, but then maybe.
Yeah, you had mentioned using data to track student progress and then using that for management evaluation systems to assign teachers sort of their improvement. And of course, in New York City, they also assign grades to schools. There's been talk in some policy circles about ratcheting that up to ed schools and tracking the performance of graduates of ed schools and their performance within the city schools. But it's been controversial and there's been a lot of pushback. I wanted to see if you could talk to that idea, see if that strategy that you're using with the primary and secondary schools might also be extended to the university level.
So we committed in our Race to Top application to do exactly that, to do what Louisiana has done and link back the effectiveness of teachers to the preparation institution that trained them. I think one open question, and I think this comes up around the school report cards too, is how do you make sure that the accountability system you create also comes with tools for how to get better? And that's one of my real worries about report card systems generally, is that accountability is a lever for improved performance, but it's not the only lever for improved performance. So when I'm with ed school deans, I worry, can I really show them what phenomenal math instruction looks like? Can I give them a picture of what their product is supposed to be? Not really. I mean, we don't have a library of fantastic practice associated with excellent student outcomes, and that's a problem. We don't have it around math, we don't have it around ELA, we don't have it in many areas. So one of the things that I think is important, even as we build this accountability system, is that we have to give people more examples of what excellent looks like, and prepare a cadre of people to help people get better. So yes, we're going to do that for teacher preparation institutions, and alongside it, I think we have to get a much clearer vision of what their ultimate product should be. One of my colleagues at Uncommon Schools has written a book, Teach Like a Champion, that has these great video clips that really capture very succinctly what good teaching looks like. At the level of, one of my favorite ones is Stretch It, right, where the student answers a question, and rather than just say, oh, thanks for the answer, call on the next person, you ask them the follow-up question. How do you know? And where in the text did you see that? Tell us on what page did you find that? Right? That mere exercise of asking the follow-up question is better teaching than just moving on to the next student. We just don't have the right body of evidence. I think the Gates Foundation with their MET project is very focused on this, trying to figure out how you build a body of evidence that links teacher practice to student outcomes. But in the absence of that, I think we risk only just sorting ed schools and saying, well, these ones are good and these ones are bad, and not giving them the tools to get better. Yes.
So there's so much focus on New York and large urban districts, and so actually I have sort of two somewhat related questions. But the first is, what aspects of your reform strategy involve non-large urban districts in New York, and what teaching challenges that you're facing in that regard? And then, I think some of us are thinking New York City DOE versus state. What are some of the selling points that you would make about working with state versus city?
I bet I'm going to be able to think about that question while I answer the other. So really, in many ways, the work certainly on the Common Core and on data and teacher effectiveness cut across geographies. I think there's a unique challenge in our rural districts in that many of them are losing population, and their capacity to execute on this agenda is very difficult. So we have school districts where the principal is the superintendent, and so those superintendents are thinking about, how am I really going to get into every teacher's classroom to observe that teacher and give them feedback, and also talk to my board members, and also manage the business official, and also make sure all the buses get off on time and get to their destination on time. So I think there's just a human capacity challenge. Are there enough people to do the work? Our rural districts also, I think, struggle with, as we move towards college and career readiness and we want to push towards advanced classes, we have districts where it's really hard to find a physics teacher. Right? And so technology takes on this extra urgency for those districts. At least I believe that technology is part of the solution, that in order for some of our needy rural districts to have the foreign language classes, the AP classes, the IB program, they're going to have to find ways to leverage technology to do that and to share resources across districts. They also, I think, have the challenge, and this is true not only of our rural communities, but our poor rural communities, but also some of our poor small cities, the just collapse of their economic base and all the things that come with that are not dissimilar from poor sections of our cities. Right? That there are places where there really are virtually no jobs, and there are no employers. I was in Syracuse a couple weeks ago, and they're literally knocking down the building that used to house the largest employer, because that building hasn't been used in a while, and no one's coming back anytime soon to use it. And so there's this impact that has on a community, where you start to feel like, well, what is the opportunity here? And part of our message has to be, well, college and career readiness is the answer. Right? Ensuring that kids leave high school with a set of skills that allows them to get new skills, to become entrepreneurs, to bring jobs to the community, making this community an attractive place for an employer to come. That is the only future. But getting that message across, I think, can sometimes be as challenging in those communities as it is in some of our most distressed urban communities. On the second point of the city versus the state, well, I think maybe I'll let Laura help me. Actually, yes, I'm going to call a friend. Yes.
So I spent, before I went to state ed, I spent 4 years working at the New York City Department of Ed. I think Jim and I had almost overlapping time.
Yeah, you were ahead of me a little bit.
I think, but just by a couple of weeks. And I say this with all due respect and appreciation for what I think Dennis Walcott will do as chancellor, but I think in New York City, the revolution has come and gone. Joel Klein has had such an ambitious reform agenda and got so much done that in many ways created a model for many other cities across the country to follow that I think influenced federal policy. And you can see where a lot of the people that worked under Joel have now gone out to other organizations. And it was an amazing experience and so much to learn. I think what is happening now in Albany under John is now revolutionary at the state level. I mean, there are 1.1 million kids in New York City, but there are another 2 million kids throughout the state of New York. In what, 690 school districts? You know, John, there's 700 school districts roughly in the state of New York. So I think you would get a broader experience in terms of understanding kind of the interplay between school districts and the state education department and also the feds. And I think there's just such an opportunity to do such amazing, innovative work now. And as John said, this is such an important moment in time. And I think also for state education departments, they're playing such a critical role that they've never ever played before. And John is awesome.
I can't add to that. Although I will say one thing about jobs with the department. I will say that I found Albany to be incredibly family friendly. Now people can work either in the city or in Albany for many of the jobs that we have. But actually, my wife, when we moved to Albany, we had been looking for a house in Brooklyn, and I will say, for the same money, you can buy a lot more house in Albany. She found that very compelling. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I work for a nonprofit, independent nonprofit called Minds Matter, and we are providing college access and mentoring. We're just trying to figure out how we can engage state ed and sort of be advocates and sort of assist you in the efforts, and even other organizations that are providing college access and success in general, hopefully for our students.
That's a good question. You know, I think we've tried to create around the turnaround schools a way for community-based organizations to partner with what I think of as our schools in most urgent need. And so we've got the school improvement grant schools, which are our persistently lowest achieving schools, the actual, the lowest performing schools in the state. But then we use some of our Race to the Top money to create a second tier of schools through a school innovation fund. It was designed to create innovative programs in the schools that aren't at the bottom, but are the next lowest tier of performance. And so I know the New York City DOE is looking for partners to work in in both the school improvement grant schools and the school innovation schools. I think that's the place. And sort of my challenge always to community-based organizations, to mentoring organizations, to youth-serving organizations is it is not enough to do the weekend program and the summer program and the after-school program. If a student is in a school that is failing that child, I don't know you can have enough after-school or enough weekend or enough Saturday or enough summer to really make up for that. Children's Aid, Rich Beery, who's the CEO of Children's Aid Society, I think Children's Aid Society just launched, I think, 2 charters, and they're about to launch more schools. And part of the reason they decided to get into the schools business was a sense that just being a partner on the side wasn't enough. They needed to take on the full challenge. Because so many of these schools don't have the capacity to get better, and they could get better on their own, they would have. And in many ways, as I look around the state, if the districts could make them better on their own, they would have. People are well-intentioned. So the question is, how do you get more capacity into those buildings? And so that's the challenge I would give. Yes, ma'am.
So I just read kind of an interesting article about a school out in Los Altos, California, that's taking kind of an alternate approach to education, where students are receiving their lessons by the computer and then having supplemental like teaching and mentoring more from the teacher, which allows the teacher to provide more one-on-one time, and they get results lesson by lesson based on the student. And I'm just wondering, like, if you guys have explored that at all for certain types of education, like specifically science and math, where that could be something that would potentially allow students to have a higher level if they were, maybe ahead of the rest of their classmates or that kind of thing. I don't know if that's something that's been explored at all.
We're beginning to. So if you were to go online and look up the School of One, which is an example in New York City, of a program that's designed to leverage technology around math instruction, sounds very similar to what you're describing, and really thinking about how do you stretch the teacher over more students in a sense. So students are working individually, then they're working in small groups, then they're working with the teacher. When they're working individually, they're on the computer with a particular activity. They've built a algorithm almost like Amazon or iTunes that helps match the kinds of activities the student is asked to do to the student's interest and skill level. So there are some examples of that. School of One is an example in the city. We've got some districts around the state. They're doing things like My Chinese, where the student is taught Chinese by a teacher in China, and they're working with them via the internet. The challenge I think we have is that the technology, the market around technology, I don't think has caught up with the need. And so I also sometimes go to schools where kids are basically parked in front of a computer doing the equivalent of worksheets. They're just PDFs, or they're just on the screen. They're not really, you're not leveraging technology for student learning. So I think sort of the next frontier for entrepreneurs in technology and education is figuring out how do you leverage technology to teach in a different way. I was in a school where the students were learning on a flight simulator, right? So the question is, how do you create the flight simulator equivalent for math? Right? How do you create a world in which students can learn things like measurement and volume through three-dimensional figures with which they are interacting? Or how do you create a social studies experience that takes advantage of the power of blending text and sound and visuals? And I just think we haven't gotten far enough. Too much of the stuff is really boring. And I think one of the things that's interesting is kids are much more demanding consumers, right? Because they compare it to what they can do on an Xbox. And then they think to themselves, well, this is terrible, right? And whereas sometimes adults, will say, oh, this is so cool. But then if you put it on a screen next to the Xbox, you would say, oh, this nowhere matches. And so I think the marketplace, there's a lot of room for growth in the market to build technology tools that leverage technology to help students learn in different ways. I just think we haven't gotten far enough with that. And there are schools that are experimenting, and I think rural schools actually will lead the way on this because they have to. But I think you're going to see an evolution in tools and also an evolution in how people think about how time is used, exactly as you're describing. Yes, sir.
I'm a student here. I was wondering what your thoughts were on the education of kids who are incarcerated. And I know there's a bunch of reforms going on in that system. Commissioner carrying on. So, what changes you were seeking to do in partnership?
Yeah. It's a huge challenge. Let me describe a very boring government activity that I think will make a big difference on this issue. So today, if you're a student, and Commissioner Carrion is the commissioner for OCFS, which provides programs for students who are incarcerated, manages their incarceration center. When those students come back to high school, the high school has to call their old high school to find out what courses the student took and what Regents exams they passed. So literally, despite it being the 21st century, the way that people share records for students is calling, faxing, asking the student, now what class? Are you sure you took 10th grade math? And one of the strategies that sometimes gets played out is to push students out, in a sense, by saying, oh, if you come to this school, you're going to have to be in 9th grade. And the student knows they've got enough credits, they should be in 10th grade. And so often that student's response is, well, in that case, I'm not coming back here. I'm not going to be with 9th graders. It's a very solvable problem. There is a data problem, right? And there's also a common language problem. We don't have common course codes. And so we don't have a way to talk about courses that is common across the state. And so we have someone who spent their day today laboriously doing the work of working with school districts to create common course codes so we can create a universal transcript so that that problem is eliminated. So that there is essentially almost like an electronic medical record for every student, electronic transcript. It will also allow students to send those records to CUNY or SUNY, right, so that they can get into college and track their credits for that purpose. So this is a very mundane thing, but I think it's really important to do to affect this problem. So I share that as an example of sort of how the mundane work of government actually, I think, can make a big difference in people's lives. More broadly, I think we as a society greatly underinvest in our young people. We particularly underinvest in young people who are in trouble. And you know, when I talk to Commissioner Carrion about how much she gets per pupil to support those kids' education, it is not enough to have the kind of staff that you need to successfully support the education of all of those students. And so one of the challenges is, how do we get the executive and the legislature to commit the level of resources necessary so that what happens for kids in those facilities looks more like school and full school. So for example, many of the teachers don't have the same level of preparation that we would require in a regular high school. And that is about a deeper problem we have of convincing people that it is better to invest in the 15-year-old in trouble now than it is to put them into prison from 19 to 35. Right? But somehow in this country and in this state, we still are willing to spend more on the prison side. There's a principal in Detroit who wrote this very powerful letter to the governor saying, please make my school a prison. Because if my school was a prison, right, if my school was a prison, I would get $40,000 per inmate, as opposed to, you know, $11,000, $12,000 per kid. All of my students would get health care. They would get 3 meals a day, and they would have safe housing to go to. So please make my school a prison. And it was obviously, you know, a very extreme way to get the message across, but there's a lot of truth in that about what we're willing to invest in as a society. So I think one of our biggest challenges is, beyond these operational issues that we can improve, what we really need are to get people to align resources differently. And that, I think, is a very big challenge. And the final point I make on that is that we also have to have teachers and principals better prepared to work with our most challenging students so that they don't end up building essentially a school-to-prison pipeline where kids have minor infractions and those turn into you know, getting the police involved, and then you get into this pattern that sets kids in the wrong direction. But that's very hard. Training people to really work effectively with our most challenging students is, I think, a very difficult undertaking.
John, I think you have time for one more question.
Okay, last question. Yes, ma'am.
So I actually want to come back to the topic of education schools quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So first, regarding the point made earlier, one, I guess, in my view, if you have test scores and things like that that are good enough to measure teachers, why aren't they good enough to measure ed schools? And then secondly, if you're talking about we need more deep understanding of what exactly is effective teaching, that probably should be the charge of these institutions of higher learning and research. But just on the topic in general, with institutions, for example, like Teacher U that is taking the test scores
mean, I agree with you 100%. You know, to be clear, I mean, we are going to report the data, and we've been very clear with the ed schools around the state that we are going to have report cards that have the data from their graduates. I just think we have to couple that with a strategy for how we capture best practice in teaching in a systematic way. And I understand that's the task of the institutions, but some of the, much like schools, some of the institutions do not have a lot of resources. I mean, we've got teacher training institutions in parts of the state. They're kind of the only game in town. There's not going to be a competitor in their region. And they're it. So we've got to have a strategy that helps those institutions figure out how to improve their practice. And sure, is there an incentive for them to improve their practice? Yes, the report card will be bad potentially. But for their faculties, so where do they go to get better? And so much like schools, I think it's right. We should identify the schools that are low performing. But then we have to have a strategy for how we make them better. And I guess the two things that we're doing. One is we are trying to shift our certification to be more performance-based. I think one of the challenges is that we don't have a certification system that holds the individual candidates or the institutions accountable for demonstrating success in the classroom. So we're trying to make our initial certification more performance-based, and also say for professional certification, you have to demonstrate that you're having a positive impact on student achievement. So before we give you a lifetime license to teach, you need to demonstrate a positive impact on student achievement. The other strategy is we use some of the Race to Top money to incentivize some of our teacher training programs to partner with schools more closely to build clinically rich teacher preparation programs that actually are focused on equipping candidates with the skills they need for the classroom. And so to provide some of those schools the resources they need to develop programs, particularly targeted towards our high-needs students, so programs serving English language learners and students with disabilities and the STEM subjects, so forth. So we have a stick strategy, but I also think we're trying to build a carrot strategy alongside that.
Great. Luke, I know you had something for Dr. King.
It's really a small token of our appreciation, and hopefully it starts raining so you can use it.
Yeah.
This
Thank
is
you.
on behalf of the business school.
Thank you. Thank you. I will say there are rules about this, and I can't quite remember what the exact dollar amount is.
It's $125, and I don't think they're a vendor.
Yeah. But I may have to share the umbrella with all SUB staff. So just to be clear.
Exactly. I know there's I think a room